Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of The Old Hunt, the end of my celebration of 10 years of Bloodborne. We are playing through version 1.00 of the Japanese release, and last time we finally defeated Marigo's wet nurse and eventually, put an end to the harrowing cries of the Nightmare Newborn, hunted the Nightmare, and now we're basically done with the game. We have a little bit more to do. We have to go back to the dream, and then we have a few loose ends to wrap up. Very, very small, because our hunt is done, and the ending that I'm aiming for this playthrough is the one where we basically do what we're told. So there's not going to be any more bosses. There's not going to be any more exciting new content that I'm going to do in this playthrough. I mean, they're in the game, right? And I'll talk a little bit about some of the other endings that we could get here because it's going to be interesting. I feel like a good way of closing out this celebration, particularly in this playthrough, is to really engage with those questions about the world of Bloodborne that I think Bloodborne really wants you to be asking. So we're going to start out by doing that, right? We're not obviously going to head straight back to the dream, make any immediate progress. And first of all, I wanted to take some time to go through the comments of the people who left comments in YouTube for the last episode. So here we go. I will be referencing my notes here and there, so if I seem to sort of lose the plot a little bit every now and then, I'm going to be trying to edit things around and smooth them out. If you notice any rough edges, that'll be why. Anyway, let's start off here. Maury Willow, and by the way, if I get any pronunciations wrong, please let me know. I apologize. I'm going to do my best here. Anyway, Maury Willow pointed out in the last episode that they were intrigued by the sort of suggestion that you can get from the internal names that are used for Marigo's wet nurse and for the Nightmare Apostles. Now, Marigo's wet nurse is the boss that we fought. The Nightmare Apostles, I think maybe this term has come up at least once before in the playthrough, but if you're unaware, those are the spider enemies that are wandering around the world. And apparently there's not really much of a differentiation between the spiders with the human faces and the spiders with the spider heads. It's both of those enemy variants are known as Nightmare Apostles. Anyway, those are both sort of external names that you can sort of find out one way or another, right? The Nightmare Apostles, you have to go through and look at supplementary materials, I believe. But Marigo's wet nurse, that name pops up right on the screen. Oh, and by the way, I thought this was interesting because I was talking before about how we had the nameless moon presence and that being associated with Lawrence and potentially Gehrman. But that creature maybe has a name that we hear the doll call out, Flora, right? Flora of the Moon of the Dream. I don't think I got that dialogue in this playthrough, but it is in the game, and you can verify it. And that sort of suggests that, the names of the great ones are a little bit difficult to grasp. Also, if you remember back to Mikolash, Kaz, or some say Kazum, right? Not entirely sure which pronunciation is correct. The name of a great one seems to be an elusive thing. And what do we have here? We have Marigo's wet nurse. Marigo, I think, I'm pretty sure, is the baby, right? Is the Nightmare Newborn whose cries we needed to silence. So Marigo's wet nurse, that's not a name, is it? That's just the function that boss was apparently fulfilling in some way, providing some sort of sustenance to Marigo. This is the thing. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but it's very hard for me not to have a million questions about this game. Anyway, to bring it back to Maury Willow's comment here, internally, right? Because even though externally, even though it's not technically a name, which is the thing I wanted to point out, right? It's the role, it's the position, Marigo's wet nurse and Nightmare Apostles. Those are external names. Internal names apparently are Lesser Demon of Death and Darkness and Kin of Death and Darkness. And what's interesting to me about that is that if you look at Marigo's wet nurse, it has 8 limbs. Right? So that sort of ties it to this idea of spideriness. There seems to be a little bit of an association at work there. And since they're both identified internally as related to death and darkness, then maybe we can see this tie between spiders and death and darkness and a sort of kinship between these creatures. Might also explain why there are so many spiders in the Nightmare of Mensis. But I don't really necessarily know exactly how to go with that, how far to go with that and what it means in a practical sense, but I think it's fascinating. So I wanted to bring that up and highlight it. Also, a little bit on a related note, Rhetorical was talking about the wet nurse as well, pointed out that the interesting thing about its being invisible, it might be meant to imply that we just don't have the insight to see it, right? And Rhetorical was making a tie not to the spider enemies, but actually to Amygdala. And they referenced a video by someone else on YouTube, Bonfire VN. I'll put a link to that in the description and maybe a quick image of the video for the image comparison so that you can see the resemblance. There is, I think, a good resemblance between the Amygdala and the Mergo's wet nurse. The body type is very similar. The arm number seems to be the significant difference. Amygdalas have 7 arms. The Mergo's wet nurse has 8. And that might go in, tie in with the whole spider thing. But I like this idea also that it might be a form of an amygdala, right? It wouldn't obviously be the same, but it could be a same sort of creature because obviously there are multiple amygdalas. There might be more than one type. And actually, there's already a little bit more than one type because some of them have the little feelers that come out of their head and some don't. I think a lot of that comes down to practicality because one is the boss version and one is the non-boss version. But I mean, we're splitting hairs here. This is the end of the old hunt. What else are we going to do? So you might go with this idea of various versions of amygdalas all over the place. And therefore, maybe we can understand, and amygdalas, again, are these things that throughout the game, they're invisible to us until we get enough insight to see them. And so if we think in that same sort of vein, right, coming back to that idea of not having enough insight, maybe we just, no matter how high our insight climbs in the meter, right, we can get up to 99, and then in the top right-hand corner there. And then if we try and get more insight than that on we can hold it in the form of Madman's Knowledge. But if we try and get more quote-unquote soft insight that way, it's not going to work. You can't get over 100. So you're stuck at 99 there, but even that is going to be insufficient to visualize the form of Mergo's wet nurse. Maybe. Well, it's also possible that Mergo's wet nurse's form is just truly invisible, because we also have the idea of the formless Great One, Erden. And that's why I wanted to bring up the formlessness, the seeming formlessness anyway, of Mergo's wet nurse and Mergo, the baby itself. Now, the wet nurse, probably not as formless as the baby, right? Because the wet nurse has the clothes that I was mentioning in the last episode wrapped around their form. And that way, right, you have a boss to fight. You can actually see all of the limbs and all of the weapons, and you know where the body is to attack when it's doing its various transformations and things, right? So it does seem to have a form, it's just an invisible one. Now, why it's invisible? Maybe it's fundamentally invisible. Maybe just that's something about Mergo's wet nurse that we can't change. Or maybe, again, we just don't have the insight to see it. So another interesting potential thought there. And then also referencing this idea of what may or may not be going on with the wet nurse, Martin Seghetti points out that if you go and look, they were talking about, I think it was a Lance McDonald video, and I will link this in the description as well, where you can see a sequence over time of the plans for Mergo's wet nurse. And something that the earlier versions make a little bit clearer than the final version does is that there's this moment where apparently the wet nurse takes up the baby that is to us invisible and appears to cradle it and then takes it up into their form. And the final version of the cutscene, you don't have that moment where it's picked up out of the cradle or anything, but the boss does sort of cover over the top of the cradle, and now, right, it's lying on the ground. And the baby wasn't, right? We could hear the baby crying and then eventually get soothed to sleep at the end of the episode. What happened to the baby throughout the fight? Well, if the old cutscenes are any guideline, it seems like the baby got taken up into the form of the wet nurse somehow, that the wet nurse was keeping it safe throughout the fight by keeping it on her person. Their person. I really want to say her because it's a wet nurse, but I don't actually know. Anyway, that I think was an interesting note. I think Martin Seghetti might have pointed out that there's a visible portion of the wet nurse model that you can point to and say maybe that's where Mergo is, but I'm not a very visual person. I've been through this multiple times with this playthrough, so I'll take their word for it. Anyway, the other thing that Martin Seghetti brought up, and I thought this was really cool, this is just a fun thing about the fight, you can apparently dodge the Shadow Realm attack, because in order to make it work in this game, it has to function like an AoE. Sort of like how, I can't remember where I found this out. This might have been like a podcast that I was listening to. I can't remember. But I remember hearing about how if you use the tiny music box in the fight against Mergo's Wetners, this was something that people were like really intrigued by for a long time. A long time ago. The game's been out for 10 years. And they thought it was very interesting that you could pull out the tiny music box that's helpful against Father Gascoigne, and you could have it interact with the boss fight, right? It makes the Wetner sort of dodge aside. And this is the part that I can't really remember where I heard, because the first thing, right, that's just a notable thing that the community discovered and then disseminated. I remember hearing somewhere that the reason that happens is there's like a projectile attached to the animation of the music box, which is how the game sort of invisibly is able to get the boss, Father Gascoigne, to recognize that the music box has been used. And so it shoots an invisible projectile at enemies and bosses and things. And the wet nurse reacts to the invisible projectile as if it were dodging away from any other projectile attack. You could see when I was using the executioner's gloves in the fight, occasionally the wet nurse would, sort of nimbly dodge aside. It's that same nimble dodge to the side that you get if you use the music box. And the reason is because of this invisible projectile. As far as the wet nurse is concerned, it's just dodging another projectile. So, slightly disappointing discovery that I remember hearing about from somewhere. If anyone who's watching has any like particular details on where that might have come from, let me know. If I can find it, I'll put it in the links, but I'm not convinced I can find it if I can't even remember where I heard it. Anyway, additional comments. This time we're moving a little bit away from the specifics of the Mergo's Wet Nurse. Rune Esper had a few points that I thought were worth bringing up. First of all, you probably saw it, right? I was being somewhat cavalier when I was dealing with the pigs and running around, and I was mentioning all through the boss fight how I didn't expect it to be super challenging. I was sort of tickled by the idea that I might die in the fight because I handled the Shadow Realm poorly. That's because I'm way ahead of the level curve for New Game. And Rune Esper was pointing out that out-leveling the curve like that is really only possible in low cycles of New Game, possibly only just the first one. As the game, this game, after you beat it, starts over again immediately, and all the enemies scale in terms of their power, and right in terms of their, I think, both offensive and defensive values. It's the only way it makes sense. And they get this multiplier, and every single time you go through a New Game, it gets harder and harder and harder. And there's a max, right? I think it's New Game plus 7 or something like that. The way that people count New Game cycles is a little bit off-putting to me, right? I have a hard time following it. But there is a maximum cycle number. And once you've beaten the game on that difficulty, the game will start again, but there's no more multipliers. It just stays at that difficulty level however many times you want to play the game. But for most purposes, right? I don't think most people are playing this game 8 times in a row. Just to go through the story content again and again and again, even over the course of 10 years. But, if you are going to do that, you do get to finally experience, after that 6th or 7th time through, right, the full difficulty level of Bloodborne, where everything is maxed out, and you really need to have your skills up at the highest possible level, because there's no way you could just tank hits and get away with things like you can in this low New Game cycle. And so I thought that was an interesting thing to point out just about Bloodborne in general. It's not entirely unique to Bloodborne. The Dark Souls games do similar things, right? It's this ongoing tradition. Dark Souls 2 actually really has some interesting mechanics when it comes to playing with New Game plus cycles, because there are items that you can use that can scale enemies as if you were in a higher New Game cycle. And when you actually do go into those New Game cycles, positions of enemies will change around. Dark Souls 2 also, I think, if you kill enemies enough, they disappear permanently, which is very different from the other Souls games. But, this isn't really about Dark Souls 2, except in the sense that Dark Souls 2 came out before this game did. So, you might have expected some things from Dark Souls 2 to reappear in Bloodborne. It doesn't really. Bloodborne works sort of like Dark Souls 1 does. It just sort of scales everything in terms of the difficulty over and over again. But that is an interesting feature of these games. And I will say Bloodborne, like the way that it scales, the beginning of your New Game Plus playthrough, the first time you do a repeated cycle, at the very beginning, with all the power that you have from the end of the game, you can have a nice, easy time of it. And I remember, personally, we're going back, we're starting to get very hazy memories here, but I remember after beating Dark Souls the first time, playing it again, and getting to the end of the second cycle in that game, and still thinking everything was pretty easy. By the end of the second cycle in Bloodborne, you're already feeling the difficulty like shooting upwards. The New Game Plus, especially if you get the DLC, the DLC, I think, in particular, scales like crazy as you go into higher and higher cycles of New Game. At least that's been my experience. So, Bloodborne, yeah, you get a little bit of catharsis at the start of your second New Game cycle, but it quickly catches up. Anyway, that's an aspect of the game that we're not going to be engaging with on the Old Hunt, just like many others. But it is a cool thing about this game, and I wanted to point it out. Another fun thing, Rune Esper, this was sort of just a relatively minor thing that they brought up, but I did think was important to call out because I just think it's a cool idea. Remember how at the end of the episode last time, I went down the elevator and looked at Queen Yearned, and Queen Yearned bows and then vanishes and disappears? Rune Esper was talking about how they always go down that elevator and they have the gesture just ready so that they can do some sort of bow right to Queen Yearned as she is bowing to us. I just love that. I love the idea of returning that form of courtesy, especially if you know it's going to happen, so you can set it up, you get the timing just right. That's great. I think that's an awesome detail. And also, while we're on the topic, so Rune Esper and I was talking about cycles of this game, did, alongside the course of this Old Hunt playthrough, had their own celebration going for 10 years of Bloodborne. They called it the Grand Hunt, and I just thought this was a cool idea, where they went through and played the game on the highest cycle, right? So they got to the highest level of difficulty in the game. They got all the runes and the weapon variants that are hidden down in the Chalice dungeons, which means they went through all the Chalice dungeons, and got at least one +10 version of every right-hand weapon in the game. And that's astonishing to me, right? Like, the game doesn't even recognize, right, with the Platinum Trophy, they don't even make you do that level of completionism. But I just think it's cool that people go out there and do that. And I'm sure Rune Esper isn't the only person to have done this, but whoever's done it, that's really impressive to me. At some point, maybe, I think I want to get to the point where I could try and cycle new games enough that I could get to the max difficulty. I do have, so in Translation Born, I did go, and I mean, to be fair, I used glyphs, and Rune Esper was doing all of this offline, and it's easier, if you're online, you can use glyphs. There are known dungeons that have the variant weapons in easily accessible positions, as well as the additional runes, right? So there's sort of known routes you can take through the Chalice dungeons if you have access to online glyphs to just make the right dungeon, get things very quickly. I was able to do that in Translation Born. So I do have that sort of completionism going on, but I definitely don't have, like, cycle the game several times, get all these +10 weapons. Like, I haven't done that. So I just wanted to call that out. That's very cool. Okay, now we're moving on to some comments from Big Gubosu, some of which I'm going to bring up right now, some of which I'm going to save for a little bit later in the episode, because Big Gubosu was also thinking ahead a little bit to some of the stuff that we're going to see in this finale. But as concerns what I was talking about in the last episode, Big Gubosu pointed out that the Chalice ingredients have always clashed with their perspective on arcane in Bloodborne. Right? The interaction with the arcane, this is according to Big Gubosu, has always been simple in terms of you ask and receive. Whereas the game necessitates a medium to do so, usually slugs or umbilical cords. These are things that make sense to Big Gubosu. They're sort of familiars or children, ways of reaching out to, like, affiliated beings. So there is a sort of internal logic there. But then there's the Chalice dungeons that require a kind of brew of parts. And I thought that was an interesting perspective because, like I was saying in the last episode, a lot of what I think the game gets in terms of, like, the iconography of Christianity, not necessarily, like, the core theme and ideas of the Christian religion, but a lot of those, like, ideas of using the body parts of saints to have these rituals of communion that fortify you in some way or another, right? And the mixing of that with the idea of the tomb of the gods, right? I feel like there's a lot of Christianity and symbolism like bound up together in that. And it's interesting to me that Big Goop also would say that this sort of clashes with the arcane as it's presented in most of the rest of the game. I don't really have my own personal take on that, except to say that I think that's an interesting observation, and I'd be curious to hear if other people think so as well. Anyway, that brings us through most of the stuff that I wanted to sort of comment on in the sort of lead-up phase here. So I have a couple more comments from Big Goop also, but we're going to save them for now. Switch gears a little bit, because we got something at the end of the last episode, and I had the screen covered up, unfortunately, because it's also important to note that like how the Nightmare Slain message doesn't pop up, the Hunted Nightmare message doesn't pop up until after the baby goes to sleep, it isn't until the end of that Hunted Nightmare message pops up that you get the final third umbilical cord. Now, you'll see I have 3 of them. Technically, there's 4 in the game. But, we didn't get one of them. And so we've only got 3. Maybe that's why there's 4 of them, is because they have a little bit of a failsafe. You can afford to not get one. So even if you don't necessarily go, the one we didn't get is the one that requires Ariana to become pregnant. So, yeah, we didn't get that one. But that's okay. We can still, if we wanted to, go for the secret ending of the game. I'm not going to do that. But we could if we wanted to. Anyway, I wanted to read this because it's the last piece of... It's not even just one puzzle. It's several different puzzles that I want to talk about and think about and, like I said, sort of speculate about, rack my brains against, not necessarily come to any solid answers, but think about in honor of 10 years of Bloodborne here. So here we go. I've talked about the name of this item already. It's the third umbilical cord, first, second, third, ordinal in Japanese. So there is the US English version that has the 1/3 of umbilical cord. I think that's a remnant of an older version of the game. But I've covered that before. Let's get to the description. Okay, I've talked about this first part before, but I might as well go over it again, right? So it has the alternate name, String of Eyes, that it's also known by, and it is a great relic. Even among great ones, only babies have this, and umbilical cord comes from that, right? Or umbilical cord originates in that. So you sort of have this idea, and I've talked about this before, that the idea of the third umbilical cord, the umbilical cord portion comes from the fact that it's only found among infant great ones. But it's not necessarily an umbilical cord. It's also known by this other name, String of Eyes. So it does maybe have something of an umbilical cord function going on with it. I sort of like the idea that there is some mysterious sort of sustenance that we could get from it. Maybe the same sort of mysterious sustenance that Mergo's wet nurse provides, because we don't actually see any nursing taking place between the wet nurse and Mergo. And the wet nurse is above somewhere the top of Mergo's loft when we come onto it and drops down from the sky. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no nutrition being provided to Mergo, because presumably Mergo has this third cord, or this cord is somehow related to Mergo, and it's helping to sort of process some sort of high level, maybe food for thought. If we're talking about higher level thoughts that the wet nurse is providing. I don't know. I don't know. That's purely theoretical. But again, it doesn't even necessarily have to be understood as an umbilical cord. It could be something more like an ocular nerve for the third eye, right? Or maybe just something else that provides eyes on the inside, right? Some special source of nutrients that could be providing the eyes of thought that allow you to think on higher dimensions, right? That Master Willem is after. And baby great ones have these because they need to process that thinking, and then the adults lose them because they've already reached that level. I don't know, this is purely speculative, but you have these ideas that are bound up together, that this is a string of eyes, and infant great ones have them. And it may or may not actually be an umbilical cord, but it sort of has been given that name because of that association, and we can speculate about why. And I've just done so at length. Let's move on to the central section here, even though it's also going to be repetitive. Right, and because this is version 1.00 of Bloodborne, some of this information has been changed to 1.09. And it's this central section here where you're going to see the biggest one, because we have, it can be used, can be held as a sort of way of warding off evil magic, right? Ma is pretty general in Mayoke, but the idea is, and I think the old official translation that no longer is in the game, also just like the Japanese is no longer in the game, is, you can keep this to ward off evil spirits. And that's basically what the Japanese is getting at. That's the first part of the central section. Second part of the second section, by means of use, you can also gain great insight, right? Or large quantity, a vast amount of insight. Literally enlightenment, right? But again, I think that insight is perfectly workable as a translation. More than perfectly workable, perfectly good as a translation here. All right, now let's get to the interesting stuff. Very final section of the description. Every great one loses a child, their child, children. Again, Japanese, it's not clear. I'm going to go with a child. Every great one loses a child, maybe its child. Not necessarily spelled out in the Japanese, but that could work as well. And seeks. Right, and yearns, right? They seek for children, a child, presumably because of what they've lost. Therefore, what do you mean, therefore? Because they're seeking a child, presumably. Therefore, this. What is this? Probably the third cord, this particular third umbilical cord, brought about the encounter with Mergo. So somehow we know this third cord was key to encountering Mergo. That means Mensis must have used it, because Mensis are the one that created this ritual crafted around Mergo and its cries. So they used this third cord in some way to bring about that encounter. How? I don't know. But it somehow it happened. And then, Sorega, so that's, what is that? Presumably the encounter with Mergo that was brought about because great ones seek out replacement children. And the interesting thing to me about this is it almost sounds like Mergo's a great one, like a fully fledged great one that wants a child, but at the same time I'm pretty sure Mergo is the child? I don't know. I'm going to finish the description and then I'll go into some of the speculation. Anyway, that bestowed upon Mensis a failure of a brain or failures of brains, right? The articles, the singular, plural, that's not very clear. But we're once again looking at Dekisokonai, right? Dekisokonai, I've talked before about, it's like this thing, the sort of creation sort of thing has that nuance that is a failure. And it's modifying the term for brain or brains. And I talked before in the last episode with the chalice materials about how Narisokonai was being used for the concept of stillbirth because we're talking about babies that failed to form. You could take that same idea and talk about a brain or brains that failed to form, that failed to be completed. And if you go with that, you'll wind up with something like the official translation of resulting in the stillbirth of their brains, right? The brains of the Mensis scholars, even though they were granted this audience with Mergo because of the use of this third cord, it bestowed upon them failed brains, right? Resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. You can see the sort of connection there. You also have the possibility that it gave to Mensis a failed brain. And if we take that idea, what does that sound like? That sounds like it might be related to the brain of Mensis. Let me try and find... Did I go the wrong direction? No, I'm in the wrong category, right? Because it's a chalice material at the end of the day. Okay, what? Okay, here it is. Finally, the living string. And what do we see when we talk about the brain of Mensis here, right? We talk about a giant brain that Mensis gained in the nightmare. Did they gain it because it was bestowed upon them by Mergo, right? And we also learned that it was a kanzen na dekisokonai. So a complete failure, a complete malformed thing, right? The brain itself, right? So it sounds like actually maybe it's possible that we can interpret this audience with Mergo as resulting in bestowing upon Mensis the brain of Mensis, because we know it's a completely failed brain, right? Even though it has eyes on the inside, right? The eyes are evil, the brain itself is rotten, and we're seeing like a word-to-word link, dekisokonai, same exact kanji even, in the idea that we have sort of this failed brain. So the audience with Mergo bestowed upon Mensis the failed brain, maybe, that is the brain of Mensis. And if you take the idea that the brain of Mensis is composed of messengers, right, there are some people who've talked about the idea that maybe the brain of Mensis is sort of what's become of the people of Mensis. It agglomerates them into this brain that's lined with eyes on the inside, but it is also a complete failure. So maybe that's what's going on with the brain of Mensis. And I wanted to wait to bring that up specifically until I had that final piece of evidence, right? The third chord where it says, in getting this audience with Mergo, apparently, that's when the brain of Mensis may have been bestowed upon the Mensis sect. I don't know about this. I think it's definitely possible to interpret the Japanese that way, and I like the link that you can get from one to the other. The leap to saying that it's composed of Mensis scholars is a little bit far for me, but I like the potential idea that getting in touch with Mergo somehow grants Mensis the brain of Mensis. The thing is, I don't really understand why that happens, and I don't understand why it encourages the eye growth. It does work, I think, a little bit with the irony, right? The idea that Mensis wants a brain that's lined with eyes, and they get audience with Mergo, who's sort of treated like a great one in the phrasing of that third umbilical cord, and they ask for something, and they get what they ask for. They get a brain with eyes on the inside that's really good at forming eyes everywhere, but that is incomplete. The eyes are evil, right? It causes frenzy just to endure its gaze, and it's not really what they asked for. So I do think that is a pretty compelling story element that you could build off of the Japanese, that the English sort of precludes a little bit, doesn't quite play as nicely. Even though I do think if you take it on its own, right, you could arrive at that alternative interpretation of the Japanese, get at the idea of the stillbirth of their brains. And we also know, right, because it's not just the brain of Mensis that we find in the Nightmare of Mensis, we also find Mensis scholars with mummified bodies and apparently worthless brains. So maybe it did result in the stillbirth of their brains? Or maybe there's a double meaning going on here, and maybe we can bring back this idea of Mensis composing the brain of Mensis, because all of the Mensis scholars had their brains sort of stillborn, and at the same time formed into the brain of Mensis, and that's what caused the stillbirth of the Mensis scholars' brains. I don't know. I don't know. We're starting to go in circles. But I do think it's interesting, and it's an element of the Japanese that is a little bit more prevalent here that you can see. So I wanted to bring that up. Okay. Now, again, I wanted to stress that the evidence that we have for understanding Mergo as the baby, right, over here in this carriage, is, right, we can look in the Hunter's Dream at the names of these places, and we can see that this area here is Mergo's loft. And we also, if we rely on a little bit of supplemental information, we can find out that the enemies that walk around the tower are called Mergo's attendants. And then, of course, we get to the top and we fight Mergo's wet nurse. So Mergo seems pretty clearly to be identified with that baby there. Also, I'm not sure how much to make of this, but you remember how much I was talking about the theming of death in Bloodborne? Well, note that this cradle here, there's a bunch of corpses all over this place, right? You can hear the crunching of their bones underfoot as I'm running around here, right? And I don't really necessarily know what the dead had to do with the placement there, but I'm thinking there's probably some significance there, especially because so many things in Bloodborne seem tied to like death and the idea of carrying on wishes and perpetuity in nightmares. Anyway, that's just a little bit of an extra thought here. Getting back to the idea of who Marigot is, right? What else do we know about Marigot? We know that Queen Yearned was concerned about Marigot. And this is going to rely a little bit on information I wasn't able to show you in this playthrough. But she had the blood on the front of her dress, right, around her belly. And if you go fight her in the Chalice dungeons, she is pregnant. And you can hear a baby crying in the Chalice dungeon of the fight, presumably inside her belly. And so it seems like Marigot is Queen Yearned's child that was taken from her by some sort of C-section style operation. And the other parent, right, because the other thing we note about Queen Yearned, she's in that bridal gown, and she's tied with these like ancient rituals of the Pthumerians. Seems likely that the child was fathered by a great one. Now that's conjecture enough already. Additional conjecture, because I've remarked before about how Marigot is apparently formless, right? Because even though like the wet nurse has the wrappings and things, there was like no visual indication at all of the baby. There was only the crying and eventually the sleeping sound. So if we go off this idea of Erden as formless and possibly identified purely with sound, that sort of makes it seem like maybe Erden was the father. So again, it's speculative, but it's not based off of like nothing at all. So wanted to bring that up. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind. The interesting thing about that, if it's true, is this means that what happens with Ariana is sort of like history repeating itself, right? And it's interesting to me that it seems to be the Cainhurst blood, right? Because in the third umbilical cord that, of course, I did not get in this playthrough, you can look and you can see that there's this sentence about it seems to be corrupted blood that began this liaison, and that ties in with, potentially, the Ariana's blood vial, where you can see that her blood was similar indeed to that which was once forbidden. Right? So this seems to imply that the Cainhurst bloodline is maybe a little bit closer to the Pthumerian line than the people of Yearned. But that's not to say that the people of Yearned have no connection, right? It's just, I don't know, maybe something's going on with Cainhurst there. Maybe you can see a little bit more strongly in Ariana, the modern day version of what you had with Queen Yearned. And I do think it's interesting, right? This is just something that I think is very cool about Bloodborne, is that it sort of builds this society that continuously denigrates Ariana, but it turns out like she is the blood of the ancient queen that the city is named for, right? We have this idea of great importance and great like arcane power that is just being overlooked. And all of the horrors, all of the work that the Healing Church is doing in the modern era, right? It's almost undercut by just this old-fashioned idea of Erden wanting to have a child and therefore ultimately having a baby with Ariana. Now, I mean, Ariana doesn't expect there to be this pregnancy and is seemingly horrified by the presence of the child. So not exactly a great thing that happens here, but it is interesting in Bloodborne's sense that it's sort of subverting the expectations, right? And you have the understanding of the world of humans that is not actually correlated at all with the way that the world of Bloodborne seems to work and the way that like the world actually is, right? So the way that we think the world works isn't necessarily the way that it does. And this ties in beautifully with the idea that the people who learn more and more about the inner workings of Bloodborne's world are sort of on the verge of madness. So I thought that was a cool thing. But what is going on, right? So now that we've established a little bit as to who or what Marigot might be, what sort of powers does Marigot have? It's unclear. Did Marigot provide, right? We know the encounter with Marigot seems to have been the thing that provided Mensis with either the brain of Mensis or that resulted in, like, after the encounter, they went mad, right? The stillbirth of their brains. However you take that interpretation, something significant happened when they made contact with Mergo. What, though, right? Like, what is the thing that gave Mergo that ability when all it seems to be doing when we find Mergo is crying? It's difficult to work out. And how exactly does the third chord tie in? Also, remember, we know from the Mensis cage that the construction of the Mensis cage and communication with the Great Ones, which Mensis succeeded in doing, ultimately got them their nightmare. Right? It's spelled out in that item description. The Mensis cage got Mensis their nightmare that they really wanted, right? And then in the nightmare, we have this third chord that we know granted Mensis audience with Mergo. And then they're using Mergo to call the Red Moon. I mean, that's its own other set of questions, right? I want to focus now just a little bit on how possibly Mergo might have been tied up into this whole thing, right? So one possibility that I worked out is that maybe the Mensis cage led Mensis to either this nightmare directly or possibly to the lecture hall, right? Maybe one of the Great Ones in the nightmare that Mensis was communicating with was the amygdala that was in the Nightmare Frontier. Maybe they went there. Or maybe they went to the lecture hall first, right? Maybe they went to the Nightmare Frontier first and then found the lecture hall. We don't really know if the connections in the Nightmare Lecture Hall work for everyone else the way that they do for the Hunter, but they might, right? There might be just this constant connection between those particular realms now. Granted, they're sort of one way. So presumably, but it does seem like Mensis was leaving notes all over the lecture hall, particularly on the second floor, that tie into other sorts of rituals like the one that happened with Pale Blood and Lawrence, right? So it seems like they did have some sort of access with that space. And they also obviously have access with this nightmare. So maybe we can sort of justify all of this. And again, right, remember, how do we first get to the Nightmare of Mensis? We have to go through the second floor of the lecture building first ourselves. How do we do that? We put our hand on the mummy in the world of Yearned with the Advent Plaza. So either that involves some sort of communing with Mikolash, or we're making use of the Mensis cages ourselves. It's not really clear what's going on in that moment. But however that happens, we wind up in the lecture building. That takes us to the Nightmare of Mensis. So maybe that's what happened with Mensis themselves. Anyway, then in the nightmare, they use this third chord to somehow call on the spirit of Mergo, which may have been adrift in the nightmare as a form of an afterlife. Because again, we don't really know what happened with pregnant Queen Yearned in the chalices and how that resulted in post-operation Queen Yearned and Mergo out in the world as a formless baby crying. So it's not entirely clear, where does the third chord exactly come into this? But I sort of like this idea that it's potentially, because nightmare realms are afterlives, potentially the spirit of Mergo may have been called, right? Maybe this is literally Mergo's third chord from the real world, but in the nightmare, it was able to gain some special ability to call out to the spirit of Mergo. And the spirit of Mergo being disturbed is what brought forth the spirit of Queen Yearned, which we get some indication might still be hanging around if we play enough of the Chalice dungeons. Again, I didn't do that in this playthrough. But there is an item that we can get at the end of them that might suggest that the consciousness of Queen Yearned persists. We already know the consciousness of Queen Yearned persists somehow, because we run across her in the Moonside Lake and in the Nightmare of Mensis. But we get sort of a physical means for how that might be going on, which also might tie in with what's going on with Canehurst. And so maybe we have this idea of a physical connection to a consciousness that could work when Mensis achieves their goal of getting the Nightmare of Mensis. They're able to use the third chord as a physical anchor to call the spirit of Mergo to them, give them the audience that they want, get the brain of Mensis maybe, or lose another portion of their scholars, or both. And that begins the cries, that begins the calling of the ritual. Also, just, I don't know, I can't stop thinking about the possibility that the two rituals are somehow linked, right? The idea of the Chime Maiden's ritual in Yahar Ghul to call the One Reborn. If they're using physical remains they found in the chalices, maybe that explains why the chalice enemies are in that particular region on the surface. I don't know. Maybe the One Reborn is meant to be some sort of physical body for Mirgo's spirit, right? We have the idea, if we're going with this thought of the third chord as some sort of physical manifestation that is going to call the consciousness of Mirgo to the nightmare realm, we could then link that to the One Reborn's body formed from all those corpses in the real world, and the consciousness could belong to Mirgo, potentially. I don't quite like that, because you defeat the One Reborn, and while the One Reborn, you can fight the One Reborn, the ritual to call the Red Moon does not seem to have stopped. So, I don't think that quite works, but I do, that is an intriguing possibility to me. Okay, now I just want to ask, what exactly do we do at the end of the game? Is this whole game about killing a baby? And I don't think it is, right? I do think that it is possible to get that interpretation, right? Because you have the baby slowly going to sleep, and then you have the nightmare slain message, and then you have the third chord, right? So that sequence maybe suggests that the baby falls asleep into the slumber of death, and in doing so grants you that third umbilical cord, and the nightmare is slain. Also, what exactly does nightmare slain mean, right? Because we're still here. We can go back to the Hunter's Dream and then warp back in here if we want, right? There's no real reason to do it, but we could, right? The nightmare realms persist, and this is its own interesting idea. I don't necessarily want to get too far into it right now, because I think I'm going to be coming back to it to some extent later, but it is important to point out, right? Even though we had the message that the nightmare is slain, the nightmare space itself is still around here. Something vital about it, right? Mirgo and the Mensis ritual, all that has been brought to an end. But the nightmare realm, that still seems active. So I'm still not quite sure what's going on there. Anyway, based on Queen Yearned's bowing to us and the child subsiding into slumber, I feel like we can maybe understand this a little bit differently, right? It feels like we offer a form of solace to the child by removing the wet nurse and claiming the third chord. And we can maybe look to the Old Hunters DLC. I know, this is version 1.00, but just making sense of Bloodborne, it's hard enough with this in and of itself. You can maybe look at some of the parallels in the Old Hunters DLC to potentially help build out our understanding of what happens here. So if you think about it, both of these things involve a Great One's child who is taken from their mother. That child has a spirit that resides in and apparently sustains a nightmare realm, which has adverse effects on the world of Yharnam. And our victory appears to have a calming or soothing effect that allows that child's spirit to move on. Now with the Orphan of Kaz, you are directly attacking the spirit to disperse it and get rid of the malevolent will, whereas Mirgo seems to just be falling asleep after we get rid of the wet nurse and do something to bring an end to the ritual. Maybe not. Maybe the wet nurse is the problem. That's a little bit of another strange question. Is defeating the wet nurse seems key to making Mirgo fall asleep, but what is it about the wet nurse's presence that's such a disturbance? I don't really know. And this brings us back to sort of the central problem that I was outlining a long time ago. Because we know, right, the whole plot logical sequence here, we know the Mensis ritual is summoning the moon. And not just the moon, the red moon. And the baby's cries are the key element of that ritual. In drawing the moon, they seem to be reaching out to Great Ones. Mikolash, who I think it's safe to presume is the head of the School of Mensis, thinks he's calling out to Kaz, or some say Kazum. But we see in the end that the wet nurse is the one who's surrounded, near the baby. So, what exactly is the source of the red moon? Is it the wet nurse? Now, that seems unlikely, because it's specifically bringing an end to Mirgo's cries, not defeating the wet nurse in and of itself, that ends the nightmare. Now, there's a relationship, right? Like I was saying, because it seems to be that the wet nurse is somehow tied in with keeping Marigot unsettled. But in and of itself, the wet nurse does not seem to be the red moon. Also, the wet nurse is like practically here, right? In this nightmare, as opposed to sort of the impending red moon of the outside world. So I'm not entirely sure it makes sense to think of the wet nurse as the red moon. We have another candidate, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of this because it gets a little bit convoluted, a little bit confusing. Is the red moon the moon presence, also known as pale blood, also known as flora? Now, this is possible because it's already associated with the moon, right? There's an easy association right there. But it doesn't have to be, because we could associate flora with the pale moon in contrast to the red moon. So I started to think, what else could we attribute to being the red moon? What could account for that phenomenon? If it's not the wet nurse, and if we don't want to say that it's flora. Well, it could be the brain of Mensis. That seems to me like it's a distant possibility, given the way that, Mensis has it chained and has seemingly taken possession of it from Marigot, right? They had the Deki Sokonai, they had the failed brain bestowed upon them as a result of the audience with Marigot, and they gained the brain of Mensis that was totally failed, right? That sort of link that I was talking about before. But even if you don't take it that way, right, we know that it's a total failure, and it seems unlikely that a total failure would be the thing that was causing such widespread troubles. And then also there's a classic thing, right? We drop it down into the abyss and we can kill it. That doesn't bring an end to the calling of the red moon. So it seems pretty unlikely that it's the brain of Mensis. Could it be Marigot themselves? And this seems unlikely to me because Marigot's cries are associated with calling the moon, right? So if Marigot itself is to be understood as the red moon, why are its cries what's calling it, right? That seems a little bit self-defeating, a little bit circular. Now it could be, I think someone in a comment in another thing had suggested that maybe Mikolash could be understood as the baby involved in this nightmare. Sort of like Gehrman is the surrogate child, presumably, in the Hunter's dream. But I don't know about that. Because, again, you defeat Mikolash, and that's not the end, right? But I think if you do think of Mikolash as the baby, it does make it at least possible that Marigot could be the Red Moon. But, again, that seems pretty far-fetched to me. Another possibility could be an amygdala, but there are multiple of them, and they already seem like their approach doesn't really accomplish anything. They're already there, right? They're like hanging out on the side of Erden Chapel already. So that doesn't seem like a good fit. Could it be actually Queen Yearned? Now, Queen Yearned isn't a great one, so that's one strike in the no column for me. And then she does have unusual powers. But then you also have to think, is Marigot being stolen the reason for every hunt? Because we know, right, old Yearned burning to the ground, that was associated with another red moon. So that would mean that Queen Yearned had to come up again because Marigot was taken again that time. And then, I don't necessarily think that makes a lot of sense either. So two, I think, pretty good reasons not to suspect that it's Queen Yearned. That leads me to Erden, which I think is probably the most viable alternative. If you want another great one involved as the Red Moon, I feel like Erden is probably your best bet. But at the same time, I'm a little bit hesitant about that because we know from that third chord that, I didn't get in this playthrough, Erden's desire for a child prompts him creating one with Ariana. So how is that same urge being fulfilled by Marigot's cries? It seems like a little bit too much to attribute to Erden, when we already know Erden's major action seems to be involved in Ariana's storyline. Now, I could be wrong about that, and it could be, I think Rune Esper brought up the idea that it might be an unconscious desire of Erden, especially as a formless Great One. It's easier to imagine Erden sort of being everywhere, and so might have this unconscious effect of reaching out towards Mergo even while being active in the city of Yearned. So I do think Erden is probably the best alternative, but just like in terms of narrative things to do, I'm not sure if I want to like go that route. But then again, right, there aren't a lot of great routes either, right? The counter to all of this, I would say, is why is defeating the Moon Presence or Flora or Pale Blood associated with ending or transcending the hunt, right? This goes back to the very first note that we can find in the game, the one that we write to ourselves, right? Seek Pale Blood to transcend the hunt. And in the Japanese, it's not necessarily transcend, it's like bring a complete end to. Seek Pale Blood to completely end the hunt. Pale Blood, from that note, is the Moon Presence or Flora. So that seems to tie pretty strongly to me to the idea that it actually is the Moon Presence. We already know that the Moon Presence is associated with the moon, right? It's in the name, you know, the pseudo name. But more than that, the approach of that Great One is tied to the Red Moon. Now, there's another potential solution here, which is that rather than referring or being the result of a single entity, it could be that the Red Moon is just a general indication of the proximity of the Great Ones, right? So maybe it's not specifically Flora, the pale moon in the item description, the red moon in this world, right? Because that's also somewhat contradictory. Maybe it's just the idea that Great Ones drawing close has the effect of coloring the moon with blood and instigating all of these effects, right? And that ties in with that note, right? The idea that the red moon would be linked to Great Ones descending and something to do with embracing children, maybe. Right? That very vague note from Bergenworth, right? Maybe it's not just one specific thing that we can attribute as being the red moon. Maybe it's this other effect. That's possible, but note that it also doesn't play very nicely with that note about seeking Pale Blood to transcend or completely end the hunt. So that still remains a little bit of a mystery in that sense. But we also have to explore the possibility that if Flora is responsible for the Red Moon, why is the object of our hunt to stop the babies crying? Because that makes it seem like if we are working for Flora, which I think is an assumption that it's reasonable to make, why would Flora be trying to get us to put the baby to sleep and stop the ritual if Flora is drawn to that child herself? That I don't really understand. But there is, like, I thought about it for a little while, and I thought maybe it's not Flora, right? Maybe this is Gehrman's form of rebellion, or maybe not even rebellion. Maybe this is Gehrman's way of keeping the world safe. This is his, like, ongoing responsibility as a hunter to guide other hunters on nights of the hunt to cease the calling of the moon presence itself indirectly so that humanity can continue on, right? Maybe Flora does want to reach out to Mergo or whatever special child happens to be on offer on this particular red moon night of the hunt, but Gehrman's there in the hunter's dream to reach out to the real world, grab a departing soul, maybe, turn them into a hunter, and say, hey, if you want to stop this, if you want to be free, you need to go silence whatever baby is crying. You need to get the moon presence to draw back from the world again. And you go about that by, stopping the cries in this particular hunt of the special child Mergo. So maybe this is a little bit of a rebellion by the hunters, right? Even though Gehrman is locked in the hunter's dream himself, bound there by the moon presence, apparently, it's possible that it's sort of a form of rebellion. It's also possible that Flora feels compelled to respond to these cries, but does not wish to, but that seems also somewhat unlikely to me. So I think that's sort of where I've landed personally. Now, you personally might have landed somewhere else. You could have logicked your way through all this logic in a completely different way. You may have found things that I've been saying in this episode very strange and off-putting. That's part of the beauty of Bloodborne, right? There's so much evidence out there, and you can try to arrange it however you best see fit and come to your own conclusions. Whew, okay, so I feel like at this point I have honored the tradition of Bloodborne. I've also gone, this episode apparently is going very long, but this is the finale. You know, when aren't you going to go long, right? If you're ever going to go for like way over time, just speculating about Bloodborne, have it be in the finale, right? Of course. Now, the other thing that I do want to point out, and this is something that I mentioned way back at the start of the playthrough, is that there is a way that you can play this game where you never go to the Hunter's Dream until this point. And I want to bring this up like a little bit just as a general reminder, and also because I happened to be watching a Bloodborne video somewhat recently. Someone was making the argument about how you could, right, like you, the hunter, come to Yearned, and then you have the ability to leave, but you decide to stay. And I don't think you do, actually, right? I think that physically you're stuck in Yearned, and then also you are tied to the dream no matter what. And if you aren't aware of the fact that people can do these dreamless runs, then maybe you're missing a little bit of the evidence. And so I do want to put this out there that people have done it. They have managed to get all the way up here and defeat Marigo's wet nurse without dying at any point, without going to the dream to upgrade their weapons, right? Think about it. None of the things that you can do in the dream you can do, like, if you're doing that sort of playthrough. So you can't upgrade your weapons. You can't get access to runes. You can't, like, you're locked out of all those special features of Bloodborne. So you can't engage with blood gems. It's all about what you find in the world running around. And you're still able to traverse nightmares, right? You're still able to go to the Nightmare of Mensis, to the Nightmare Frontier, to the lecture building, all these various places. You can still go to them, but you just can't go to the Hunter's Dream. And even so, at the end of all of this, you defeat Marigo's wet nurse. What is your only option? Your only option now is to go to the Hunter's Dream. And if you do that in the dreamless playthrough, right, then you get a special cutscene where it's the same as the first time you awaken in the Hunter's Dream in a regular game, except one thing about it is different that is also going to be different when we warp back to the Hunter's Dream. So I'll see you there for what's changed. Hey, look at this. The workshop is on fire. Right? Isn't this cool? I just love this image. This is so amazing to me. I think it's beautiful. And, like, it's just such a surprising change. First time you play this game, it's like, whoa, what happened? The whole warehouse is on fire. Workshop. The whole workshop is on fire. This is astonishing. And, what does it mean? It has something to do with the end of this hunt, right? The end of this particular cycle, it seems. And this actually brings me back to, I mentioned before that I was going to come back to some of the Big Goobuls's points so that we were a little bit more forward-looking. Well, Big Goobulsu had a comment on this. The dream burns, which causes a cycle to end, or is at least associated, this is my words now, at least associated with the ending of a cycle, right? This is potentially indicating that it's time for a change. It's time for maybe a new hunter, maybe another thing to change, right? There is some sort of aspect of this that is all coming to an end now that the hunt has been achieved. Anyway, back to Big Goobuls's point here. It requires something to change, even though Gehrman remains captive. But our hunt is over, which can be translated to, we can't be attached to the dream forever. We know that Flora doesn't sustain the dream or the doll from the final ending. The final ending, the secret ending, you sort of usurp the moon presence's place, right? You become a great one, an infant great one yourself. And what happens? The doll picks you up in the Hunter's Dream and has some words to say to you. And so that is some evidence right there that, again, these nightmare realms persist. I was talking about that a little bit before, right? And so we have the ending where we could become a great one. We have the ending where we end up sort of taking Gehrman's place, where we get captivated by the moon presence, and then maybe end up serving as its surrogate child. That's sort of how we're able to reason ourselves into the position that Gehrman finds himself in, is because that's what can happen to us in the second ending, right? Oh, and I'm remembering something that I was talking about, not wasting the insight of the third chords where they reset. Right, so if I were to choose a different dialogue option in this playthrough, I would be able to experience a different ending now that I'm going to do this. But I'm going to be consuming these third umbilical cords. Sorry to do this in the middle of a point, but I swear I will forget completely if I don't do this now. So I just want to make sure not to overlook this, not to neglect it. There we go. Right? So anyway, to return to Bigu Boss's point, now that I've gotten my insight up here, we know that Flora doesn't sustain the dream or the doll from the final ending. It exists forever, yet it has imposed rules, and the hunt resets with the Yearned playing for the next cycle, with New Game Plus, right? Nobody achieves anything or really benefits, which seems like a curse. So there is that change here in the workshop that's very cool, and if you get the, if you do the dreamless run, you get the, waking up in the dream for the first time, except in the background, the workshop is on fire. Because it's already over. But what does that imply? That implies you've been tied to the dream the entire time anyway. And it's only now that you have to return to it and face Gehrman. So no matter what, even in a game where you never go to the Hunter's Dream, you're still tied to it, right? To bring that other point full circle. I feel like I'm getting worse at conveying the upshots of all these points, but
Good hunter,
I'm getting there in the end.
soon break.
Oh, shoot. All right, I'm going to speed through this because I want to actually get that dialogue again. I think she will repeat it if I just talk to her again. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there. Go ahead.
Gehrman awaits you at the foot of the great tree. Go on, good hunter.
Okay, shoot. Okay, actually what I'm going to have to do is reset the game. I'm gonna, cut ahead to when I've done that, and we'll get the dialogue that I skipped over. Okay, alright. I've reset the game here. I've reused the insight thing, so we're basically back where we left off. Didn't want to have to redo all that speculation. But now we can talk to the doll, and I won't interrupt.
Good hunter, you have come. Dawn will soon break. This night and this dream will end. Gehrman awaits you at the foot of the great tree.
So it's interesting that we get the idea that this night and this dream will end, right? It's like the dream is tied to the night. Now we know the dream is ultimately going to come back, right? Again, this is something that Bigu Bosu was pointing out, and that even without, right? You go into a new game cycle and then it continues. But even if you don't think about that, right? Even if you think about your new place as a great one, it does seem like the dream continues. Even with the hunt over, even with Flora out of the picture. So it's a little bit odd that we get that dialogue about the dream and the night soon ending. The night soon ending. Maybe the doll is speaking from our perspective, assuming that we're going to be obedient. Interesting. Also, I realized I haven't gotten all the dialogues from the doll, so let's get the final one here.
Good hunter, your presence somehow soothes. I sense the ancient echoes. They course your veins.
Right, and I do think this is one of the places where we're seeing a little bit more in the Japanese about the idea of us inheriting the wills of the slain. Because, yes, the ancient echoes course our veins, right? I think if you go, extrapolate the idea out, you can make sense of it, right? You have these lingering aspects of those who have come before from time immemorial running through our body and giving us strength in a way that's tangible to the doll on the outside, right? So if you work at it, you can get it. But I don't think you necessarily have to work at it in, I don't think you're likely to arrive at that conclusion if you don't already know that it's something to do with inheriting the will of the slain, which again is just a little bit more prevalent in the Japanese side of things. And then, I'll put up on the screen a quick, slightly more literal translation of that set of lines. Probably doesn't sound as good, but I think it does get at that aspect a little bit that I feel like unfortunately doesn't quite come through as strongly in the English as I might have liked, that this is about inheritance, right? The bequeathed will, right? That sort of idea. I think that's just a little bit stronger in the Japanese than it is in the English. And I don't really see a great way around it, but it is a little bit of a shame that sometimes that sort of thing gets lost in translation. Again, on the whole, I think the translators have done a phenomenal job with this game in what was very clearly some trying circumstances. But anyway, I thought that was worth mentioning. Might as well level up here. Just again, we've got resources. We might as well spend them before we go through into another cycle.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
Okay, that much is the same. And then we already got the repeat about, Gehrman awaiting us at the foot of the great tree. Okay. I think it's almost completely pointless for me to be repairing my weapon right now, but there you go. And of course, I don't want to have any blood echoes left over, so we're going to come over here. Grab some blood vials, because why not? Alright, now the foot of the great tree. We've never been there before, because that part of the dream has long been closed off to us. The first time I played this game, I was very confused about where Gehrman was waiting for us. But a little exploration shows you that these gates now stand open. So we can move on now into a new part of the dream. And isn't this just gorgeous? I just love this. They really save the really striking scenery in the dream. As much as the regular part of the dream that you run around in is very striking, this scene here is striking in just an entirely different way. Because again, you have the large moon, but it's framed now along the tree. You have the burning workshop, which even if it wasn't burning, I think would be a nice set piece there. But now that it is burning is incredibly impressive. You have the rows of graves that are everywhere. You have these structures that are sort of reminiscent of crucifixes that, in old Yearned, we would see beasts, strung up on these, essentially. But here, they're just standing almost maybe as grave markers in addition to the graves. Pretty cool. And, of course, in the distance, we have these strange pillars and the weird cloud formations in the sky and all the flowers along the ground. It's really cool. All right, now, I want to just remember, right, what we saw with Alfred's strange behavior. He completed his hunt and he killed himself. We come over here, we see all these graves, right? They stand in the memory of many hunters who came to this dream over time. Right? These are maybe ways that we can sort of anticipate a little bit what is otherwise going to be an unexpected choice that we're going to be confronted with when we speak to Gehrman.
Good hunter, you've done well. The night is near its end. Now, I will show you mercy. You will die, forget the dream, and awake under the morning sun. You will be freed from this terrible hunter's dream.
So that's very interesting, right? We're going to die, and that is going to free us from the dream. Now, we've wanted to be free from the dream. I don't think we really necessarily want to die. But it is interesting, right? We have all those graves that stand in the memory of the other hunters. And this first option here, right, is entrust your body to the second, right? That's obviously a literal translation, right? Gehrman here is serving as the role of a second, like in a ritual suicide, right? A seppuku thing, right? So the idea is you're not actually going to commit seppuku, but you're going to offer up your body and he's going to cut off your head, right? Because that's the way that the second, actually, I think technically the second leaves a little bit of a skin flap so the head stays on, but kills you quickly so you don't suffer from the intense pain of disemboweling yourself, right, in, samurai tradition. But, I mean, Gehrman here, we're going to see the visual, is going to take his role a little bit differently than, it would be in, feudal Japan. So, there is a little bit of a difference there. But and I do think it's interesting the way the Japanese phrases this question. It's a little bit different than I think I remember the English. This is part of the game that I haven't looked at in translation born, so I don't know what the English is off the top of my head here. But it's just interesting to look at the Japanese and get at this idea of a kaishaku. So he's going to essentially act as our executioner to free us from the terrible dream. And like I said, this is the ending where I'm going to do as I'm told. But Big Gubosu, right? This isn't a specific comment that they left in any one particular episode. Like, it's definitely not the last one in particular. But there have been a number of episodes where Big Gubosu has been thinking through some of the implications of how you let go of the dream in this game and how it works. Because Big Gubosu, like, has a little bit of a more intensive approach to this game than I do, where I see certain things, I'm more apt to attribute them to like gameplay conveniences, whereas Big Gubosu wants to really think through as much as possible what if everything is tied into the lore. And I think this is really interesting actually, because it never would have occurred to me to question this, but if you say no to Gehrman here, you go into a boss fight. If you die in that boss fight, Gehrman has killed you in the Hunter's Dream, yet you are not released. You remain in the dream. And you can challenge Gehrman again and again and again. And if you defeat Gehrman and you've consumed the 3 third chords, then the moon presence descends and you are not overawed. It is repulsed by the power of the insight that you have gained. Apparently, something weird happens. And then you fight the moon presence. And when you do that, you can also die. But you're still in the dream. You still can't actually lose. You're still bound to the repetitious cycle of the dream. And again, I would consider, as far as I'm concerned, that's just gameplay convenience, right? That's no longer attached to the story. As far as the story is concerned, you beat each of these bosses on the first try. But Big Gubosu brings up this idea, this perspective, that maybe we can understand the act of relinquishing the dream to be doing the work here. That's the differentiating factor. That to get this ending, we have to truly wish to be done with the Hunter's Dream. And in relinquishing our will in that way, that is how we're able to separate from it. As opposed to just dying or being killed by Gehrman or the moon presence, something like that. Because if we play out those scenarios, we can die and we're still tied to the dream. And I think that's fascinating. Right? And of course, Big Gubosu, if you feel I've misrepresented your idea here, please let me know. Because this isn't my idea, and it's not one specific comment I'm drawing from, so I'm much more likely to get it wrong. But that's my interpretation of it, and I think that's really cool, actually, because it works super well with the idea of, right, the dying will. Right? It's if you're at peace, if you're willing to relinquish that will, that desire to go on, then you gain the ability to come back to Yharnam, right? To be freed from the dream and awake under the new dawn. If you're still feeling bound to this place, if you're not ready to give it up, if you wish to continue for whatever reason, then you can't be freed. And that sort of volitional sense of whether or not you can be severed from the dream, I think is really interesting and really in line with Bloodborne's themes. Even though, like I said, I sort of feel like the idea that, okay, if you die to Gehrman or the moon presence and you stay in the dream, that sort of feels to me like it's purely a convenience for the gameplay. But I do actually really like the potential, interpretive act that you can take in this surrendering of your will. So, anyway, we're going to choose this first option. We're going to do as we're told, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ending that we get, just to tie things up here as the credits roll.
Farewell, my keen hunter. Fear the blood.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
Isn't that great? What an ending. That's so wild, right? You wake up under the light of the morning sun in the real world, but in whatever your outfit was of choice. And who else is left in Yearned? Was that Yearned that we were running around in? Is that maybe the first time we've ever actually set foot in the place? Was it all a bad dream? Who can say? Oh, it's such a cool idea, such a cool ending. And the fun thing is, right, you see the doll praying to a new grave in the hunter's dream at the end of that ending there. If you go through another new game cycle, right, when you wake up in the hunter's dream again, there will be a new grave there where the doll was praying to, like just as it was in that cutscene. And so the first time, if you get the Yarn of Sunrise ending, your hunter is like immortalized in the hunter's dream from that point on, like ever going forward. I just think that's so cool. And then, of course, this ties in really, really well with my pet lore theory for this run, where I was talking about how our hunter might be like a spirit and sort of maybe in between life and death, right? It's as our spirit is leaving our body, we find the maybe purgatory style place that is the hunter's dream, and we're able to take refuge there even as we're bound to it. Very interesting, right? Because then it makes sense that when we die in the hunter's dream, we're able to then wake up in real life. So even though we have a grave in the dream, even though we died in the dream, that death brings us back to life. So there it is, right? There, if you accept that that is what happened, that we have this sort of spirit form, that we go to the other side, right? That may be indicated by the scent of the moon on us, right? The moonlit sense could just be an association with the moon presence and the hunter's dream. Doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the sort of spirit form that I've been theorizing about, but it could wrap things up. And again, we have the example of Mikolash, right? Now I'm waking up, I'll forget everything, right? You will die, you will forget the dream and awake, right? And the morning sun, whatever the exact line is from Gehrman. So there's a little bit of a parallel there with Mikolash, right? What happens to us in the dream? We die. What does that mean? We wake up and we forget everything. And of course, there's the amnesia, right? It seems to be like maybe it works both ways. Maybe it's not just waking up that involves forgetting everything. Maybe it's the transition that causes you to forget things. And of course, we start the game with a bout of amnesia. And so maybe we're running around in sort of this world where dream and reality have begun to blur thanks to the red moon, and we're more on the dream side because we're more in this spirit type form. And then as the hunt ends and everything is pulled apart, we die in the dream side, we're revived in the, living side, the real world side, and we're present in the world to wake up and move on into the new dawn. And, it's not necessarily what happens, right? There's other ways that you could make sense of this, but over the course of this playthrough, I've sort of talked myself into it. So anyway, that's just some final lore theories from me. We went very long in this episode. I do want to show off the credits just because all these people worked hard to make this incredible game, to make it a possibility, to get it out. All the people who did just all these different aspects related to Bloodborne, and I think for the most part did an amazing, amazing job. And this game has been just tremendous in my life for the past decade. Just first from playing it, and then eventually from doing Translationborn, and other things like The Old Hunt, and like this game has just meant so much to me over so much time. And it's actually kind of funny. I was thinking I might actually tell this story in an earlier part of The Old Hunt, but it hasn't really come up naturally. But just to me, this game is like huge, right? And I think this is really funny because I started Translationborn 2 years after the game came out, and I'd been working on it maybe for about a year, right? So Bloodborne was off the height of its highest popularity. It was no longer like the it game, but it was still the most recent FromSoft game. And I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and I was saying, yeah, I'm doing this series where I'm analyzing all the decisions and choices translators have to make when they're translating from Japanese to English, and I'm using like Bloodborne to base off my translations and talk about the ways that like these decisions can influence the storytelling, particularly in Bloodborne. And my friend looked over at me and he said, that's a good idea. Have you ever considered doing that for a popular game? And I thought, what are you talking about? Bloodborne's super popular. And I mean, popular is a relative standard, right? I'm sure that Bloodborne has a vast and dedicated following, and people have been coming to it, like back to it over the years, right? But there, there's popular for a single player game in the style of, a FromSoft developed game. And then there's popular in terms of like, I don't know, some giant MMORPG that everyone's playing. Or whatever the like forever games are that are out there. And those are two different standards of popularity. But I just thought that was a funny story. And for me, like the 10 years that have passed here, I've been so actively engaged in stuff to do with Bloodborne that it feels as new and fresh and popular and big as it ever has to me. Even though, like, objectively, it's probably a lot smaller. Like, we're down to some hardcore fans. A few people, of course, I'm sure, are still discovering it all the time, but yeah, I do feel like the biggest days of Bloodborne are behind it, but thanks to all of you for joining me on this playthrough. You have helped make this celebration special.
Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. Whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
Do we get the whole cutscene again? I don't think we do. Oh, we do. All right. Well, I don't want to watch that whole cutscene again. I'm still in the armor. That's ridiculous. Okay. Anyway, I am kind of glad that this worked out the way it did, because I did want to start saying my thanks, express my appreciation for anyone who's been following along with this playthrough in any way, right? Whether you've been following right along in real time, whether you've taken your time to find this playthrough, whether you've been commenting all along, whether you've just been watching and enjoying, whatever form in which you've engaged with this celebration of Bloodborne of 10 years, I want to thank you for coming along for the ride. I hope you had a good time. I hope you thought this was interesting. I didn't really necessarily know what this playthrough was going to be, and so it sort of got shaped as it went along, and I hope that Bloodborne means anything to you like it means to me, that it's a very special place in your life. I'm sure there's people out there who love Bloodborne even more than I do, but I just think it's incredible, and I want to thank all of you for being with me, for joining me on the old hunt. And I am now going to call an end to all of my old hunting. I'm going to get back to a more modern version of the game. I'll keep this on in the background, maybe still keep trying to chip away at that arcane rifle spear off screen in the background. I'll make no promises, but we'll see what happens. Until next time, right? I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break. I need to regather myself, might be making some reference material videos. I'll come out with a channel update video as to what's next. I'll be transitioning back to Translationborn. That's definitely my next move. I'm excited to get back to translation analysis. But anyway, thank you all for joining me. I'm calling an end to the old hunt. It's been an incredible 10 years of Bloodborne, and I'm looking forward to what comes next. See you in the next series, everyone.